I always believed that a wedding was not just a promise of love, but a moment when you meet your person and begin building a life full of hopes and shared dreams. But on the day I stood before him in my white dress, realizing I couldn't have been farther from happiness, I suddenly understood. I couldn't continue living in a world so far removed from what I had imagined. My wedding dress, soft and shimmering, felt heavy like chains, and I could feel everything I once held dear collapsing. Behind the scenes of this grand ceremony were things I couldn't ignore, a family I couldn't accept, and a man who seemed to mean everything to me yet increasingly showed his weakness before them. I thought I could handle it, but my heart whispered that something crucial, terrifying, and inevitable had already begun, and nothing would ever be the same. My name is Peyton Lee. I'm 26 years old, and like many girls, I always dreamed of my wedding day being special, the most important and beautiful moment of my life. I spent a long time preparing for this day, choosing the dress, selecting the venue, even ordering the flowers. My mind was filled with bright thoughts, brimming with hope and anticipation. But I had no idea that fate had prepared not just a surprise but a real blow to all my dreams. We were standing in a vast hall adorned with white flowers and golden ribbons, and my eyes wandered over familiar faces. My mother sat in the front row, slightly nervous but smiling sincerely, her gaze filled with pride. She was there, despite all the years that had passed since my father's death. She was the only person I could truly trust. And although everyone said a wedding was the bride's day, I knew my mother was the most important part of the ceremony for me. My eyes accidentally met those of Arthur, my soon-to-be husband. His face was lit by the same gentle smile with which he had once promised never to leave me. We had met back in university, but despite knowing each other for so long, I sometimes still felt as though I was living in a fairy tale and that each day with him was a new happiness. But as is often the case, reality is far from ideal. My mother-in-law, Laura, had been interfering in my plans for quite some time, constantly commenting and advising on how everything should be and how it was proper. I disliked how she tried to control every aspect of my life, but I didn't want to argue. I hoped things would change after the wedding. We would build our own home, and she would stay in her place, out of our business. But in the most pivotal moment of my wedding day, I stood before them in my pristine white dress, feeling the weight of Laura's gaze upon me. Standing beside me, she laughed and said, "This is how you train a daughter-in-law." She said it with a laugh, looking straight into my eyes. I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. The only thing left on my face was the thick layer of cream I had generously applied before the ceremony, and now it felt as though someone was wiping it away, leaving only bitterness and heaviness in my soul. "Mom, that's too much," I barely whispered, unable to muster more words. Laura just smirked, as if nothing had happened, and continued, "Why are you taking this so seriously? It's just a little surprise the bride shouldn't frown over." I realized her words made no sense. To me, this wasn't a surprise, it was humiliation. At that moment, I understood that the day I had envisioned so beautifully had become my worst nightmare. Laura, with her taunts and manipulations, and all those people standing around like spectators at a show, had turned my wedding into some kind of farce. I felt something break inside me. It wasn't just irritation, it was a feeling of complete intolerance. Every word from Laura sounded like a blow, every action like the final step toward destroying what was supposed to be the beginning of a new life. I didn't know how to react. A storm of emotions raged in my head: anger, shame, pain. I wanted to be strong, but it felt as though I was losing myself. And then, as if by instinct, I felt I couldn't stay there any longer. I took a deep breath, unable to bear the weight of what was happening, lifted the hem of my dress, and slowly walked toward the exit. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. My ears rang, and my face burned with shame. I couldn't see what was happening around me. My mind was clouded, and all I could think about was escaping. I didn't hear Laura yelling something behind me, didn't notice the stares of the guests, didn't understand what was happening to Arthur. My own wedding felt like some invisible trial I couldn't pass or comprehend. When I almost reached the door, I heard Laura's voice shout, "Peyton, where are you going? We've only just begun." I couldn't stop anymore. Turning around, I ran outside into the cold air and shut the door behind me. I felt the chill envelop me, but it wasn't from the cold. There was such ice in my soul that nothing external could disturb me anymore. Day by day, my relationship with Kyle grew more serious, even though we both always tried not to rush things. He was someone it was easy to be with, and in his presence, I felt cozy and calm. But when he invited me to dinner that winter, on the day I turned 25, I sensed something was changing. His expression, serious and focused, couldn't help but make me uneasy. I was a little nervous but also excited, as if something important was about to happen. We were sitting in the restaurant, soft music playing around us, and the fire in the fireplace flickered with a dim light. It was a cozy evening, just the kind I loved, quiet, with the faint scent of fine wine and the undeniable feeling that someone had been anticipating this day with particular reverence. We talked about many things: work, friends, what concerned us in life. But his gaze, it was different. It held not only care and attention but also attention I hadn't noticed before. When we ordered dessert, his hands, resting on the table, trembled slightly. I handed him a spoon and almost unconsciously felt the weight of his gaze on me. I knew something significant was happening, and that feeling wouldn't let me go. His eyes weren't cheerful and carefree as usual. They had turned serious, as if he were preparing for something monumental. I began to worry that my expectations might not align with what he wanted to say. After I took the last sip of wine, he took my hands in his and began to speak. His voice was quiet but clear. I could feel the words he was saying start to lose meaning for me because I was so engrossed in how different he looked. Something about it was so deeply serious. "Peyton," he said, his gaze fixed on me. "I can't keep it in any longer. I love you." I froze. Love? These words were so simple, but at that moment, they seemed so big and significant, as if he wasn't just saying, "I love you," but "I'm ready to share my entire life with you." I felt a wave of emotion rise in my chest, my heart tightened, and everything around me seemed to slow down. I looked at him, and his eyes were full of sincerity. It felt as though, for a moment, the world had stopped, and everything around me became clearer than ever. He looked at me, waiting for my response, and I realized that my words would matter not only for the two of us, but for the rest of our lives. "I love you too," I replied, feeling how easily the words came, as though I were saying something that had always been hidden deep within me. It felt as natural as breathing, as simply living beside him. He smiled, but not immediately. Instead of embracing me or kissing me right away, he just looked into my eyes, and I understood that there was more he wanted to say. But instead of continuing in the way I expected, he looked at me with an expression that was almost conflicted, as if he were still deciding something. Then suddenly his face grew serious, almost worried. "I've been thinking it's time to take the next step," he said. "Are you ready for this?" I instantly understood what he meant. His question wasn't about moving in together, though that was important too. No, his question was about something far more significant. I could only nod silently because I was ready. I was ready to accept whatever he would propose. From the moment I said yes, our lives changed. We began building a future founded on mutual trust and care for one another. I felt our bond grow stronger with each passing day, and with every step, we became more inseparable, more an essential part of each other. And then, months later, when I stood before him in a white dress on that long-awaited day, the day I had always envisioned as the moment of my love, my life, it felt like everything was going exactly as it should. But I didn't know that not everything in my life would be as smooth as it seemed on that evening in the restaurant. Because at the moment when his mother approached me, when her laughter broke into that important moment, I realized the world around me wouldn't be perfect. And even though Kyle and I would have each other, we would still have to deal with those who didn't always understand what it meant to love and be loved. "This is how you train a daughter-in-law," she said, laughing, and I felt as though everything in the hall suddenly stopped, as if that moment were caught in a trap. I remember the moment Kyle quietly said, "I'm marrying you, Peyton. Don't worry about what they say." He held my hands in his eyes full of warmth, and I felt his kindness wrap around me like a soft blanket. But despite this, there was still something in my heart that wouldn't let me rest. I couldn't shake the doubts that gnawed at me more and more each day. I truly loved Kyle, but I wanted more. I wanted his family's acceptance. I knew how important his parents, especially his mother and father, were to him. And the more I tried to build a connection with his family, the more acutely I felt that I remained an outsider in their world. I sent them gifts, flowers on birthdays, wrote welcoming messages. I tried, but I could feel an invisible wall growing between us. It wasn't the warm family dinners, the support and approval I had imagined. Instead, I often felt like an observer, someone to tolerate rather than embrace. I tried to rid myself of that feeling. On the surface, everything seemed fine, but inside, I was boiling with anxiety. I knew that marrying someone meant stepping into a new life, a step I needed to take with full awareness of what lay ahead. And so, on the wedding day, when I stood at the altar beside Kyle, in the white dress I had picked out with my mother, everything felt like a hazy dream. It was the day I had waited for so long, and everything seemed perfect, yet something felt incomplete. The moment we said our vows was magical. Around us were friends, family, everyone looking at us with warmth and smiles. But amid the crowd, among all the congratulations and flowers, I felt a familiar chill again, uncertainty. Because despite that perfect moment, one thought kept echoing in my mind. What if I can't truly become part of this family? After the ceremony, we went to a reception far grander than I had imagined. Guests in elegant suits and dresses, bright lights, music, jokes, and laughter. It was like a movie. But the more I tried to enjoy the moment, the more I felt out of place. Pleasant yet unfamiliar faces, smiles that weren't entirely genuine. It seemed as though I no longer had the strength to keep building these relationships. I felt the tension growing, and it became harder and harder to hide my discomfort. But Kyle was there. His hands, his steady words, his support, everything I needed. He was my anchor in this sea of doubt, even if I couldn't quite understand why. He seemed so sure of us, of our future, of its happiness despite the obstacles. And perhaps that was the only reason I couldn't just leave everything behind and walk away. The only reason I couldn't dispel this fog surrounding me and allow myself to simply enjoy my day. The congratulations, some sincere and others less so, continued, and I smiled, glancing at Kyle as though he were my shield. He knew how to calm me, knew how much I needed to hear his words to believe everything would be okay. In his eyes, I saw everything I had dreamed of for so long, and yet the anxiety still clung to me. That moment, standing among people surrounded by celebration, was so vivid and yet so cold. It felt like a scene from a painting in which I didn't know how to act, how to take a step forward without falling into the emptiness. "Peyton, wishing you happiness," said one of Kyle's distant relatives, a woman with bright red nails I had immediately disliked. She extended her hand with a smirk, and I felt the cold breath of stereotypes and expectations envelop me once again. I took a sharp breath, barely able to look at him. Kyle's gaze, full of desperation, left me with no choice. He seemed torn between loyalty to his family and me, and I could see how much it pained him. He had always been so kind and patient, but now his face was marked by anguish, and I couldn't help but notice how his strong hands trembled slightly. "Peyton, I don't want to go back there." His voice was quieter than usual, as though he feared my answer. I didn't know what to do. I loved him, but what was happening at that moment left me unmoored. I couldn't just keep going, pretending everything was fine, that his family's actions and their subtle yet unbearably sharp jabs didn't hurt me. I couldn't continue pretending that their disdain didn't affect me, that I didn't feel the invisible weight of their doubtful, mocking gazes pressing on me with every step. "I love you, Peyton," he said with such warmth that for a moment I thought I could forget the pain, forget everything that had happened before. But I knew it was impossible to just forget. "Can't we just leave it in the past?" His words felt like they came straight from his heart, and I felt their weight pressing against my chest. He was so sincere, so full of longing to rid himself of this burden, but I couldn't. I couldn't just erase everything that had happened, everything that had left such a void in my soul. Leave it in the past. I looked at him with desperation, unsure of what to say. He knew my feelings were genuine, but he didn't understand what it felt like to be rejected and alone among people I had tried so hard to please, to understand. It hurt so deeply to see how his family treated me, how their words and glances left invisible wounds in my soul. I tried to speak, but my lips were too dry, and the words wouldn't come out. "Do you even realize what just happened?" I stopped, feeling the breath catch in my throat. It seemed like the entire situation had spiraled into something monstrous, and I couldn't even grasp what I was about to do. I couldn't find the words immediately. I needed time to process everything that had happened, to understand my feelings. This wasn't something simple, something that could just be erased from memory. I needed to reflect deeply on what I felt, on what had occurred. But Kyle stood before me, and I knew that my decision would have enormous consequences for him. "I need time to think and sort through everything," I finally said, but the words sounded so foreign and incomplete that I felt a twinge of guilt. He frowned, his voice trembling. "Are you leaving me?" he asked, and there was so much pain in that question that my heart clenched in my chest. I shook my head slowly. No, I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to lose him, but at the same time, I couldn't remain in this atmosphere of constant expectations, disdain, and dissatisfaction from his family. I couldn't simply forget how they looked at me the first time I entered their home, how their words were sharp and cold, how I felt like an outsider among them. I couldn't keep pretending it hadn't happened, that those memories weren't lodged deep in my consciousness. I couldn't go on living with gritted teeth, trying to please people who didn't accept me. "No, Kyle, but I can't pretend everything is fine," I said quietly but firmly, feeling something break inside me. I couldn't do it. I couldn't continue living this lie. "I need you to understand that your family's actions have hurt me deeply. They've hurt me in ways you can't even imagine." I couldn't stay in that room any longer, with those stares, with that feeling of emptiness and loneliness. I turned and walked away, unable to stand still any longer. My wedding dress trailed behind me like a heavy veil clinging to my body, and with every step, I felt something shift. I was leaving this dream, this world in which I had tried to be part of something I couldn't belong to. And as I walked, everything around me seemed so distant, so alien. I was confronting a new reality I wasn't prepared to face. A week later, I received a message from Kyle. "Can we meet?" I hesitated, unsure of what to do with his invitation. On one level, I knew it was time to meet the man I had thought I would spend my life with. But on another level, I felt tension building in my chest. Anxiety, fear, and doubt overwhelmed me, but not meeting him felt even worse. We agreed to meet in a small park that had once been a special place for us. Once, we had sat on a bench there, laughing and talking about a future full of hopes and dreams. But now, the place had taken on a strange tone, emptiness, uncertainty, even dread. I arrived first, clutching a small bag in my hands as if it could protect me from whatever I was about to hear. When he appeared, I immediately noticed how worn out he looked. Shadows under his eyes, punched shoulders, heavy steps. It was as if an invisible weight was haunting him. Kyle approached me, and his gaze was filled with remorse. I knew this meeting wasn't just a conversation. It was a moment when everything needed to be laid bare. "Hi, Peyton," his voice was hoarse, clearly strained as he tried to keep his emotions in check. "I know I've hurt you." His words were slow, each one drawn out like a heavy stone being lifted. I nodded silently, signaling that I was listening. But at that moment, I couldn't feel the warmth with which he had once spoken such phrases to me. Everything was colored by what had happened between us, by what he had allowed to happen, and by what he hadn't done when I so desperately needed his protection. I've spent every day since then thinking about how I let things spiral out of control, he continued, his voice quieter, his expression steeped in guilt. I could feel that guilt, like an invisible net binding us both, but no matter how hard he tried, I couldn't let it go. "I didn't take your feelings seriously. I see that now," he added, his face tense as his fists clenched, as if trying to hold back words already spoken. "And I know my family can be difficult." "Not just difficult, Kyle," I interrupted him, my voice steady but fueled by a growing fire within me, a bitterness that had only intensified over time. "You stood by and watched as they humiliated me. You could have done something. You could have stood up and said, 'This is my wife, and I will defend her.' But you didn't." He fell silent, as if my words had struck him to the core. I knew his pain wasn't feigned. He genuinely regretted it, but words alone couldn't undo what had been lost. I couldn't bring myself to believe in his regret because the image of that day, his mother's mocking glance, his father's cold indifference, was still so vivid in my mind. I couldn't forget their icy detachment, their disregard for how their disdain was breaking me. "You're right," Kyle said, and his voice carried the weight of true understanding. He fully grasped that he had failed to stand by me as he should have. "I should have done something. I should have defended you, but I didn't." My voice broke, and I felt the pain spill out once more. I tried to hold it back, but I couldn't. "Do you know how much that hurt?" I asked, the words sounding as though I were questioning myself. I didn't want to complain or make him feel worse, but the words poured out of me. "You just stood there and did nothing. You watched them tear me apart and stayed silent. You didn't make me feel like I was on your side." He stood before me, his eyes filled with pain and disappointment. I didn't know what he could say, and even if he tried to justify himself, I doubted I could hear him. This moment was the culmination of everything we had endured. And despite all his sincerity, I realized this wasn't something I could forgive immediately. "I don't know how to fix this," he said quietly, almost confessing. His words were honest, but they carried no solution. I stood there, feeling nothing but emptiness. The silence between us hung heavy, an unspoken acknowledgement of the significance of this moment. We were two people who understood that there was work to be done but were ready to undertake it together. Kyle kept his word, and it turned out to be far more meaningful than I could have imagined. In the weeks following our conversation in the park, his actions became my solace, my anchor. He became the person I had always hoped to find in him, the man willing to fight for us, for our relationship. Day by day, as we spent more time together, the resentment between me and his family began to fade, slowly but steadily. But it wasn't easy, not everything resolved itself overnight. Kyle worked tirelessly to rebuild those bridges, and it wasn't just an act of the heart, it was a matter of principle. He knew that if we wanted to be together and create a future, he had to learn to set boundaries that had previously been absent in his relationships with his family. I remember one day when he invited his mother for coffee. It seemed like a small gesture, but for us, it was a milestone. He didn't just ask her to meet, he said he wanted to talk. The word talk sounded like a declaration to me. He promised to be honest and open, to tell her how her actions had affected us. Us. That word made me start to believe that perhaps we could become not just a couple but something more. When Kyle returned from that conversation, his face was different. He looked like a man who had weathered an internal storm, but he wasn't broken. "I talked to her," he said. "She said I sounded sincere, but still." He trailed off, searching for words. I didn't need him to finish to understand that his mother hadn't accepted his words as easily as he'd hoped. I knew that in his family, things had always been that way: dominance, control, traditions that seemed unchangeable. But he had tried. I could see how hard it was for him, how conflicted he felt in that moment, but he still continued. She said I need to respect her and her way of life, that it's different from ours, and that if I want her to stay in our lives, I have to learn to accept that. The conversation had been difficult. I could hear the tremor in his voice, feel the strain it had put on him. But I saw that it was a monumental step for him. He had stood before his mother, raising the bar for himself, to defend us. He demanded respect, prioritized our life and our future. And that meant more to me than any grand promise. Knowing that he was ready to acknowledge her mistakes and talk about them showed me he was serious about fighting for us. I remember noticing how his mother, too, began to make an effort. It wasn't a sudden change, but rather small, meaningful steps. I saw her gaze soften, her tone with me become less guarded. She no longer maintained the same distance as before. Though she remained cautious and reserved, her attitude toward me became warmer. It was the first real step toward becoming part of their world, and I could feel it in her words and even in her eyes when she looked at me. These weren't grand gestures, but for me, for us, it was a genuine breakthrough. When Kyle and I walked through the park where we had once sat together, we both felt the shift. He had grown stronger, more confident in his commitment to fight for us. I began to believe that we could overcome anything that stood in our way. Yet I also understood that many challenges still lay ahead. Too many questions remained unanswered, too many doubts unresolved. But for the first time in a long while, I felt that we were heading in the right direction. And I was ready to move forward with him, no matter the obstacles. We both knew there was still much work to be done, but now, we had hope.